Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Sophie, and I'm one of the education staff members here at the Aquarium. Now, what's really fun about today is although we are not in the same room physically, you will have a chance to interact with us as well. So I have my friend here in the studio, Cole, who is controlling all the cool stuff going on that you see behind me. And one of the other cool things is that he is also monitoring our text and call line. So if you want to get engaged with us today, which I encourage you to do so, you are more than welcome to text us live at 562-286-1838. And I'll go ahead and be able to respond to your questions, your feedback, or your comments on the air. And also, if you are watching this after the fact and you still want to ask your questions or maybe share something, you are more than welcome to email us at live@lbaop.org. So again, a couple of ways for you to get engaged with us today. Now, what's really fun about today, as you might have seen by clicking on the video, is we have a very cool topic today. But before we do that, I always like to warm up our scientist brains. So you may be thinking to yourself, you're like, well, I'm not sure I'm a scientist, or I'm not sure that I have a scientist brain. Well, what's interesting is that a lot of things and a lot of scientific questions we often ask start with something very simple like observations. So what I would like you to do to warm up those scientist brains is I want you to take a couple of moments to make some observations about what you see going on here behind me. Now, this is a live webcam of one of our exhibits here at the aquarium. So if I were to walk upstairs into our tropical gallery, I would have a similar view to what you have right now. Now, you are always more than welcome to watch our live webcams either through our website or through this website right over here, explore.org. This is just one of the several live webcams that we have here at the aquarium, and we use them a lot to check on our animals and see what they're up to. So feel free to share any observations, or if you're in the room with somebody, you can let them know as well. Now, observations can be anything you see with any of those senses that you have. But in this case, we are probably using our sense of sight. So you can always pull pre-existing knowledge in order to use some observations, like any of the colors of the fish you see, maybe if you recognize them from video games or movies or anything else. You're more than welcome to share those as well. Now, oftentimes, even really, really big things that scientists are curious about sometimes start with observations. So feel free to share any of those if you have them. And I'll also make some observations in the meantime. So kind of going across the bottom of our screen right now, I see a shark that's kind of small. It's moving kind of quickly. And also towards the center now, I see a much larger shark. Since they look a little bit different, I am going to believe that those are two different kinds of sharks that we have right there. That big one we have is a zebra shark, and that small one we have is a gray reef shark. And even though they look different, they are both kinds of sharks. Now, is there anything else? Oh, here comes the zebra again, too. Anything else that you notice, or anything else that you would like to share? So something else that's very special about this area that we are looking in is that it's very much characterized, or we can tell what type of area it is, based on all the colorful kind of corals, those rocky things we see all around this area. Now, what's really cool is that this specific habitat, or home for these animals, is a tropical reef. So these are areas that very much have a lot of color. We see all sorts of different type of fish living in them as well. Or also, not even different types of fish, all sorts of different types of animals. We have all of our different fish. Sometimes we get our turtles in here, but a lot of animals rely on this specific habitat, which actually is a very big word that we will be talking about today. Today we are going to be learning all about different types of, well, not all about different types of habitats, but we're going to be learning about one habitat specifically. We'll be learning about our tide pools. Now, before we get into that, what's really special about habitats is they can be all sorts of different things. Think about maybe other different places where animals live. If you can think of any habitats that we may have on land, what are some different habitats you're able to think of? Or maybe think about an area that might be really hard for you to survive in. Now, when I think about habitats, I definitely think about all sorts of different places, but a habitat that I don't think I could survive in right now is probably one that's really cold, one that probably has a lot of snow around it. So that's an example of a type of habitat, maybe an Arctic habitat or a subarctic habitat. Are there any other kinds that you can think of? Or you can also use that question, what is an area that I may have a hard time living in right now? For me, it was the really cold. You may say something like a very, very hot area. And that can be true for us and also all sorts of different types of animals. Depending on what the habitat is, there's a whole bunch of different things that make the habitat special and things that may make it really easy for an animal to live in or maybe really hard for an animal to live in. But today, when we are talking about habitats, one of the main things I want you to think of is it being a home for different types of animals, and also that habitats can have things that are the same and different about them as well. So right now we see a really good example of one of our tidepool habitats, which we'll be focusing on today. Now this one's filled with all sorts of animals, and also we see it a little bit more close up. But one of the things I would like us to do first while we describe the habitat, the tide pool, is I want us to take a look at a habitat from maybe, or the tide pool from maybe a bird's eye view. So if we can take a look at one of our more zoomed out videos of the habitats or the tide pools, that would be a really good place to start. Now also, while we're doing this, feel free to make observations, feel free to share them with us, and also, if there's any questions you have, feel free to let us know as well. So we can go ahead and take a look at that much larger tide pool habitat, and let's see what things we can notice about it as well. Perfect. All right, my friends. So right now we are getting a bird's eye view. Well, unfortunately, we didn't strap a camera to a bird, but we're getting a drone's eye view of our tide pool habitats. Now, I want you to think, what are some things that really stand out to you about this habitat? What are some things that seem to be across the entire thing? What do you notice? Now, oftentimes, when we are initially sharing some first observations about tide pools, some of the things we notice are there are a lot of rocks. And that's because tide pools and these habitats are the areas on the coast where the land meets the sea. So oftentimes they can be kind of rocky like this. Now, something else that's also really interesting about these habitats is that things are always moving. We always have the water moving around, whether it be those crashing waves, whether it be high tide or low tide when the water comes up closer to shore, or when the water moves and is a lot further away from shore. So things are always moving in these tide pool habitats. Nothing is ever kind of staying still. And honestly, that's very much true for the ocean. The ocean moves a lot, or is very dynamic. That's a word for movement. Now, something else when you're looking here at the tide pools is, do you see any spots that you think would be really comfy? Like, do you see any spots that you could lay down in right now, that you could live in right now? Unless you really like cozying up against a rock, I think these areas and these habitats are kind of hard to live in. And that's because it's very, very rocky. It's kind of hard to sleep and lay on rocks. And also, it looks like everything's really wet, or at least at some point will be wet and kind of slick. So that may make it kind of hard to walk around and move around on too. Not to mention, we have all that water moving around, so that's something else that may make it a little tougher. Now, if we have a chance, can we take a look at just our still picture of a tide pool? We have a nice still picture that we can look at of it too. So that was a really good video to see what it's kind of like when everything's moving around. But now I want to take a little bit of a closer look at that still area so we can maybe see where some of those animals might be hanging out. Now, something else with the tide pools is you may hear the word pool in it. And that's really true, especially as we take a look at this more still picture, as you'll see a lot more of those little tiny pools, kind of just like that. So here, it is a picture, so we don't see the water moving around as much, but we do see these waves beginning to form here in the background. And these are going to be crashing all along these rocks. But now we get a really good look at those small little pool features in this habitat. So in these areas, I like to think of them almost like mini little lakes or like mini little jacuzzis. They're really small areas of water. Sometimes they can have a couple of inches. Sometimes they can have maybe a foot, maybe a couple of feet of water. But the bottom line is that these areas are not very deep in these tide pool areas. Now, something else is you'll notice, especially here towards this back area, right now it looks like these areas are covered with water. But what's really interesting along our coast is we have a high tide and a low tide. So because of the moon influences where the water is moving around and if we have high tide or low tide. And sometimes the water will be all the way up here. That's when we have a high tide, when the water's all the way up as highest as it can be. And sometimes there's no water here, and maybe just this area will be filled up. And that's when we have low tide. So high tide is when the water is all the way up as close as it can be to shore. And low tide is when it's all the way back as far as it can be without like a tsunami or something. Because in really extreme circumstances, sometimes the water pulls back a lot more. But those are very extreme, not in this case. But what's interesting is if there are any animals that find themselves in this area during high tide, at some point they may not be covered in water, especially during the low tide. And that's something these animals may need to consider or something that may affect their survival. Now, something else when we're talking about habitats is all living things that live in those habitats, they need their needs met. They need things in order to keep surviving. So what are some things that you need in order to keep surviving? I know for myself as a human, I need food, I need water. I usually need sunlight, but I don't need it as much like a plant to photosynthesize. But sunlight definitely helps a lot with some of the functions we have as an animal. Now, if we think about some of our animals that live in the ocean, they may have other needs that they need to have for survival too. So they'll probably have the same ones, maybe water to some extent. They'll definitely need food, but a lot of our ocean animals also need to stay wet or stay under the water for periods of time. Because a lot of animals oftentimes get their oxygen from the water, and also sometimes their skin or their body requires them to be in water the whole time. So those are special needs that these animals and tide pools are gonna have to be able to figure out or overcome. And sometimes in order for them to overcome all those difficulties or those challenges they may face, they develop really special traits known as adaptations. Now, adaptations are just things on animals that make them really special, and usually it's something that they develop over time in order to survive in a specific habitat. Now, especially when we talk about the tide pool animals here, they're going to need a lot of special adaptations because this is a kind of tough environment to live in. There's not water all the time. Also, since it's a little bit more shallow, they're more susceptible or more easy to get with predators, especially like birds that don't have to dive too much. They can just look in here. Or any other animals that spend their time along the coast just like that as well. So now that we have some of our big vocab words kind of learned for today, we know that habitat is a home for different types of animals, and all sorts of different animals may live there. And we also know that adaptations are special things that animals have in order to help them survive. And remember, surviving means having their needs met like food, maybe water, or also maybe in this case, staying wet. So if we can go back to, or maybe we can go to one of our photos that we have of a couple of our animals hanging out in the tide pool, then we can start taking a look at what makes some of those animals special. But I think it's time for us to start taking a look at some of those animals in there. Perfect. Okay, my friends, we have a couple different types of animals in here. Now, are there any that stand out to you right away? Ooh, that's kind of a special one. We have a small little fish coming by, one of our painted greenlings. And while we're here, I'm going to go ahead and share a special adaptation that fish has. Even though on the screen it looked about like this big, in reality, that fish is probably like this big. Maybe gets a little bit longer. Now, being a kind of small and compact size is good for this fish because it doesn't live in that deep of an area. This tide pool right here is probably deep, probably about like 3, maybe 4 feet, but sometimes they can be a little bit more shallow. So being a small, compact size is also a good adaptation that they have. Now, I see a lot of animals right over here. I see some of our sea anemones, and we'll talk about them in a second too. But I also see a whole bunch of different types of sea stars, or some of our starfish. Now, does it look like any of the animals in here other than our fishy friend are moving around? I don't really see anything moving around too much other than maybe like the anemone tentacles and some of our fish in there. And that's also something that can help them out in the tide pools. Because there's all those waves coming and crashing around, a lot of animals that you may find in tide pools may have abilities to stick or hold on to the sides of things. And our sea stars are a good example of that. Now, with our sea stars, we get all sorts of different colors, and you can kind of see that right over here. We got an orange one. We have one that may look a little bit more fuzzy over here. We got some purple ones, too. Now, something you'd notice if you were touching or using your sense of touch with these animals is you'd notice that they feel really, really hard on them. That star right behind me, that leather star, those tend to feel a little bit more slimy, but a lot of stars tend to be really, really hard. And something else you'll also notice too, or if you work with sea stars, is you'll know that they're really hard to pick up and move around because on the underside of them, they have special tiny little suction cups called tube feet. Now, I'm not sure if we have a video or pictures of our tube feet, but if we want to pull that up, we can. Oh, perfect. And so they have tiny little suction cups right here that are kind of like the suction cups of octopus, just really small. And those allow them to get a very good grip onto the sides of things. It also makes them pretty good eaters. So what I mean by that is if the sea star is able to go this way. If it's able to get just a couple of its tiny little tube feet on something, it can essentially grab and hold on to that and also keep that animal from moving away. So let's say it's maybe like a really slow snail or a really slow crab, just using a couple of those tube feet and grabbing it means it'll still be able to eat it because it has a good grip on it. Now, something else that's really cool about sea stars is that their stomach is here in the middle of their body, and when they're eating, their stomachs actually come out of their body. So what they do is they kind of ball up a little bit when you see them eating. They throw up their stomach. They get the food that they have. They kind of surround their stomach with it. They digest their food, and then they flatten back out, and their stomach goes back into their body. So that's something that's really special about these guys, is that their stomachs come out of their body, and also they have all those little suction cup feet right over there too. Now, I know I mentioned earlier that we don't see the sea stars moving super quickly, so that is something that their tube feet are a big advantage that they have, but also moving slowly may be a little bit of a disadvantage. Here we see one of our fastest sea stars that we have here at the aquarium. No, this video isn't sped up. This just happens to be a very fast collector star. I'm not too sure, but we have different types of sea stars, and they have different speeds. But usually they're kind of slow, and so that can be a little bit of a problem if you are a sea star and you get stuck in a higher up area during low tide. You may be out of the water for periods of time. So that's something you may want to consider, especially if you're one of these animals that really sticks onto places and has trouble moving around or moves kind of slowly, is you may get stuck at that low tide area and you may be either out of water or maybe you're going to be more accessible and more easy to grab from some of those bigger predators or maybe like birds or things like that. So although they have a lot of advantages, that is something that you may have to consider, maybe a disadvantage at some points. Now, there is another animal that also doesn't move around too much, does a really good job at sticking in different places, and is one of our tidepool friends. So if we could start taking a look at some of our sea anemones, I think that's a good spot to go next as well. Now, sea anemones are a little bit different than our sea stars. What are some things you notice about it that you could consider different? Or maybe some things that you look at it and you're like, I don't even know what that body part is on them. What are some things that you notice? And again, they can be colors, they can be things that you recognize from other animals. Now, I know when I look at the sea anemone, one of the big things that stands out to me right away are all of these long things along their body. Those are the tentacles of our sea anemone. And that is the primary the way that they use the most in order to get their food. So has anybody ever touched a sea anemone before? Either at an aquarium or maybe at other institutions? But sometimes when you touch a sea anemone, especially along the tentacles right here, sometimes they kind of stick to your finger. Now it doesn't hurt, but sometimes they stick to your finger, kind of like those slappy sticky hands that you may get. And so with the sea anemone tentacles, what actually are all along them are tiny little stinging cells. So these guys are like a cousin of jellyfish. And when we think about jellies, one of the main things that pops into our mind is that jellies sting. That's the main way for them to get their food. They don't go running down or chasing after their food, and sea anemones are the same. When you look at them, do you actually see anything that may help it move around? Do you see any tube feet? If you think about other fish, do you see any fins on them? Do you see any tails on them? I don't even see any like hands or legs or little claws like lobsters or crabs to help them move around. And that's because anemones don't really move around too much. They kind of plant themselves where they are and hold on tight and hope things are good. Now, they can move if they need to, but they're not really moving and actively hunting or following their food. Instead, they wait for something to swim by, and they use all of those sticky tentacles to sting their food, and then they kind of close up, kind of like this one that you see right over here. Now, even though this just looks like a water balloon, that is actually a strawberry anemone, one that's more pink and white, just kind of closed up. Now, with the anemones, they are a little bit of a simpler creature, so they don't really have any brains, they don't really have any big things that telling them what's going on in their body. But they do have stinger cells to help them get food, and also they have a mouth as well. So we can see their mouth very easily right here in the middle of them. Now, sea anemones don't have any teeth, they don't have anything that could bite us. But what's really interesting about that mouth in the middle is that it's actually their behind. It's also where they go to the bathroom. So they have one entry and one exit hole, and that's where they eat. It's also where they go to the bathroom. Now, as a human, you may think about it and you're like, oh, that's kind of a little gross. But with sea anemones, like I mentioned, they don't have brains, they don't have taste buds, so it's not something that they recognize or know that's going on. That's just how they exist and how they function. Now, since sea anemones are not good at moving at all, like I mentioned, they hardly ever move, these are animals that may have a very difficult time when it's low tide, when the water's gone all the way back. But what's really special about some of these tide pool animals is that sometimes they can survive out of water for periods of time. And those can be several hours at a time, especially as you have to think about when the high tide's coming back again, or maybe when they'll be underwater again. Now, these animals, also like jellies, are made a lot out of water, and that's something that may help them, especially when they end up at that kind of low tide area. So with these animals, even though they're not good at moving, they may have other things that make them a little bit special, like being able to survive outside of water for periods of time. And so that's something that you'll definitely want to consider, or a special adaptation that these animals will have, especially because they can't really move. So that's like the big thing, not that they think, but that's the big thing they may have to think or worry about, especially as a tide pool animal. But in terms of being able to protect themselves, they have those stingy tentacles, and that's kind of about it. So they're very much squishy and very jelly-like. And if you have the chance to touch sea anemones, like I mentioned, they won't hurt us as humans because they're not strong enough to hurt us as big animals, but they do have stinging cells in them. Now, another question you may be asking yourself if you think about sea anemones and other animals that may live in them is, isn't a certain type of fish that we all know and love, the clownfish, doesn't that like to hang out in sea anemones? But how does it not get stung? Well, sea anemones and clownfish have a very special relationship called a symbiotic relationship. And that's just a really big word for meaning that because they're both friends with each other, they both get something out of it. And so what the clownfish has is a special mucousy coating on its scales so that it doesn't get stung by the sea anemone. So the clownfish can live in the sea anemone, and what the clownfish gets in return is that it has protection, because any other animals or fish, any other animals or fish that try to follow it into the sea anemone will probably get stung and stuck. Now on the other side of it, you may be wondering, well, what does the sea anemone get? The clownfish will help clean any little debris or things around the sea anemone, and also can maybe scare some other animals off that may want to try to eat its tentacles or something like that. So by both of them being friends with each other, they both get something out of it. Now that's a very special type of animal relationship. Sometimes there are other animal relationships where only one animal gets something and the other animal kind of suffers as a result of it. But in this one, they're both even. They both get something out of it. Now, unfortunately, in our local tide pools, especially here in Southern California, we're not going to be able to see any of our clownfish hanging out in those sea anemones because they are a more tropical animal. However, if you do want to take a look at some clownfish living in sea anemones, I definitely recommend going to areas that are a little bit more tropical, or maybe visiting an aquarium where you can take a look at some of those tropical animals as well. But that's a really good example of a symbiotic relationship and something that's cool about our anemones that live in more warmer places. The ones here may have special relationships with other types of fish too, just not the clownfish because they're more tropical. Okay. Now, I believe we have time for one more animal, so I'm going to ask us to take a look at one of our favorite little tide pool animals that likes to hang out, some of our octopuses. Now, sometimes when you think about octopus, or when you think about squid, you think about really, really giant animals, especially like our giant Pacific octopus, who is one of the largest species of octopus we get. Now, giant Pacific octopus, when they're little, you may find them in those tide pools, especially because there's not that much water. But once they get bigger, it may be a little bit uncomfortable for them to hang out in those small areas. But what's really cool about octopus is they only have one hard part in their body, and it's their little beak. I actually have one of the beaks right over here. Now, they have a beak just like a bird, And so with the beak, with the octopus, that's the only hard part in their body that they have. So if their beak is about this big, they are able to shove themselves through any hole that is slightly bigger than their beak. So that's something that might help even that really big giant Pacific octopus out with. But sometimes what we see are a lot of smaller little octopus living in those tide pools as well. Now, there's all sorts of little nooks and crannies that some of those small octopus can hide in, and especially since it's only that one hard part in their body, they can squeeze themselves through whatever. But similar to our sea stars, the octopus will also have little suction cups on them as well. They have those little suckers. Now, something else that's really special about octopus, and something that you all may know and love as well, is that they are masters of hide and seek. They are really good at playing hide and seek, and that's because they can kind of hide with whatever they would like to. They have really special little cells on their skin that allow them to change color. So that means that if I am an octopus, and let's say I'm hanging out against a background that's maybe orange or maybe green, I would then be able to change my color to be orange or green to match the area behind me. So even though they may be a little bit small sometimes, they're still able to change the area that they're hanging out, or change and match the habitat, which is something that's special. And here we got a good video of one of our octopus moving around onto a coral reef, and we see it change its texture too. It looked very smooth at first right now, but then when it lands on the really rocky and kind of corals that have a lot of texture to them, you see it change its texture right there too to match it. So that's another special adaptation that the octopus have. They are able to change their color, and that may be helpful, especially if they're in those tide pool areas where maybe they don't have too much coverage on them. Now with octopus, because they're good at moving around using their tentacles, I would think that they may not get stuck in the low tide as often. However, every now and then sometimes it does happen. And when they're stuck out of water, that may not be good, because then that means there's all sorts of other animals that can get them, whether it be other birds, maybe it be other things that are swimming by, or even sometimes us as people. We don't want to be too harmful. We don't want to negatively impact or affect these animals if we see them at those lower high tides, especially when we're tide pooling. Now, I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about some ways that we as humans can be really good when we're going to our tide pools and making sure we leave all these animals alone and not bother them too much. So when we're at tide pools, it's actually, well, let me go back a second. Tide pools are some of the areas along our coast that are relatively accessible. And I say that as if you're able to get transportation there, if you're able to get yourself to the beach, then it's relatively accessible because you don't have to go scuba diving, you don't have to put any water gear on in order to get to the tide pools. You can just kind of go walking around and looking at them. Now, with that in mind, if you are visiting any tide pools, it's always a good rule of thumb to make sure you're checking around where you're stepping on things. You don't want to be stepping in tide pools. You don't want to be messing stuff up. You also want to be careful when you're turning things over because lots of other animals may be living there. So you can always take photos of things, you can take a closer look, but I would be kind of wary, or I'd be careful touching things, especially because we don't ever want to be disturbing the natural behavior of animals, and also we want to be careful to make sure we don't hurt ourselves. Now, when you're going around looking at tide pools, you also may want to check the tides, because when you have a really low tide, that's a good chance for you to see a lot of those animals that may be hanging out in those small pools. And also, it may be easier to get to some of those areas too, because remember, at high tide, the water is all the way up. So there are a lot of local places here in Southern California. You can go tide pool. You can go a little bit south to Orange County. You can go to Crystal Cove. You can go further up north to the Palos Verdes area, and you can take a look at some of them there as well. But these are one of the habitats that are easiest to get to just because you don't have to go swimming out in the ocean in order to see them. Now also, be careful because some of the rocks may be very slippery as you're moving around. But if you are interested in tide pooling, I definitely recommend you do so. And by being here and learning today, you had a good first start at learning about some of the animals that live there. But also, any research you want to do on your own, I encourage you to do so as well. Checking when the best tides are, maybe when the best seasons are, and also seeing what types of animals you'll be able to see locally. Sea stars are ones that you'll be able to see, sea anemones, and if you're really lucky, you may get that super elusive octopus because they're really good at hiding. So if you do have any more questions or anything else you are curious about, you are more than welcome to reach out to us. Our email is live@lbaop.org. And if you're curious, I definitely encourage you to keep exploring, and you can go see some of those tide pools for yourself. So I do want to thank you all for hanging out and watching with us today. If you have any more questions, like I said, feel free to reach out to us. But I hope you enjoyed learning about the tide pools, learning about the habitats and the adaptations those animals have. And I definitely encourage you to get out there and see some of them for yourself. So once again, thank you for watching, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.